Hello everyone, welcome to the Dialogue Society's first online seminar. We hope you and your loved ones are safe and well during the current pandemic. We're joined today by a very special guest, Professor Hardy, Chair of Intercultural Relations and Founding Director of the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University. Professor Hardy leads on the university's academic interfaith with the UN system. Today discussing the title, Educating for the Middle Way, the Social Capital for Peaceful Relations. Just before I pass the floor on, or mic as we would now say, I'd just like to remind our viewers that they can like, share, subscribe, and also ask their questions in the comment section below. Thank you very much. Mike, the mic is now yours.
Thank you so much, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. And this is a really strange time. Strange time for me. This is the first time that a live YouTube lecture. But we so wanted to maintain the continuity of the Dialogue Society's conversations, and I was so very pleased to support. But it's a strange time because a lot of us are locked in. A lot of us are at home in different contexts, and I'm sure I'm talking now to people who share my discomfort of being locked in and away from social interaction. Of course, social distancing is about spatial distancing rather than social interaction. So I hope that this can in part contribute to that. And we look forward to your questions and your comments. I'm writing at a week or 10 days, I'm talking rather a week or 10 days after the very sad death of a colleague and someone I feel was both influential and a little bit of a mentor in my thinking and my career, Dr. Fouad Nadi, who died about 10 days ago due to complications related to his health. I'm not sure, I don't have information whether it was related to the current virus context that we have. But I raise, and I'd like my talk to be dedicated to him and his memory, and the memory that I have warmly of the passion that he held for some of the issues that I shall touch on. Fouad was a really important figure in my later life. I was a simple economist trained, and first part of my career was as an economist in British universities. And it was only after I left the universities to work in foreign affairs and British Council in particular that I became really interested in the an issue of faith and its role in the contemporary world and in modernity. My talk this morning is very much about how I can look again at some of those issues and relate them to the context of the role of education. And I'll come to that very quickly. But it's in essence what Fouad had done, Dr. Nadi had done in his life. He held no great administrative office, no founding director of this or chair of that, but he was an amazing communicator. And if that's not in essence the strength of our work together and with the sponsorship of the Dialogue Society, nothing else. So he was a communicator who made contacts and connections, hugely significant ones when it really mattered. He was born in 57, the end of the 1950s, a period of post-war period in the world which was reassembling and reorganizing itself in a way I think perhaps that it will have to after this virus. And he lived at an amazing time, of course, when British Islam in particular was emerging from and becoming very distinct from Asian Islam generally that we'd inherited. And the period of the Rushdie affair, the period of 9/11 and the London bombings were all part and parcel of the way his power and his energy and his communications developed. The two things that I wanted to refer at the beginning of this talk were the two amazing innovations, which is how I came to meet and know him. Although I did know his mentor, Zaki Badawi, very well from the work we were doing with then the Three Faiths Forum and the Faith and Belief Society organizations it's called now. But the two things that Fadi introduced, firstly, were an amazing form of communication through satirical and humorous Muslim publications in the UK, Muslim Wise and Q News. This was quite a radical departure from what was available before, as I'm sure some of you will be aware. Most Muslim communications had been up till then funded from outside and not necessarily generated within the context of fear. And the second, after the tragedies of London bombings and the violence that hit the streets and the public transport in London, he took the message out to communities. He communicated with passion by founding the Radical Middle Way, a community interest company which focused on the power and role of education and of context, and delivering programs and events that promoted the idea that good belief, good religion, good faith is the way to tackle extremism. He was born to an Indonesian mother, and I spent 4 years of my life working and living in Indonesia. And my paper this morning, this afternoon, this notion of the middle way comes very much from my experience there and work that we're still doing there in looking at transformations in social capital in Indonesia and the way in which social capital is addressing some of the issues that I'll relate to. So, educating for the middle way. This paper really outlines some potential strategies within education which could interrupt the spread of violent extremism. And I centre my ideas on the notion that extremism, violence and education are all, in contemporary language, what we call wicked problems. I'm keen to explore some of the complexities around the challenge we face with these wicked problems, reflecting that it's hugely tempting to identify singular root causes of behaviours and jump in with an equally singular solution. And often case that is the way in which education and educators approach problems that they confront. But I also want to begin a conversation around some clear and potential workable approaches to how we might resolve. I want to provoke our thinking. I don't have the answers. And I want to encourage dialogue that brings collaboration and collaborative exploration on this, what is essentially the biggest question of our time. In an age of real uncertainty, of turbulence, of rapid change and human insecurity, all systems, I suggest, must adapt and respond. And this includes the education system. So I'm going to look at education as a system and argue that it's not that what we should change within our schools, within our curriculum, within our classrooms or our universities, but we must challenge whether the system itself is fit for purpose, fit for the contemporary purpose of our modern times. So I look at potential strategies within education that can support younger people to prosper and to contribute positively in modernity itself, which is itself a wicked challenge for everyone. By wicked, of course, I'm referring to using language about problems which are so complex that when you think you've solved them, you've sometimes made them worse. When you deal with one aspect of the problem, you can create and generate out pops another problem, and it makes them very, very problematic in themselves. So through identifying the problems in examining the challenges of contemporary times, when extremism, including violent extremism, has become so embedded in the way we relate one to another, I argue that education must change then as a system, rather than through a policy that just focuses on learners. So within systems, diversity is needed, a variety of belief systems encouraged so as to guard against polarization. And my comments look at theories of change for education systems that can help generate the creativity that can undermine the wicked problem if it can't remove it. Promoting pluralism and outcomes for the middle way. is my sort of theme. So I look at a theory of change in my work, discussing the notion of turbulence that follows value pluralism, working with the enabling constraints of human rights, building confidence and resilience, and developing active networking for social change through the recognition of innovative social capital. And all four of those combined are required. Now, this came about really from my interactions with wonderful people in Indonesia when I lived there, and more recently in research that I've done there, looking at how Indonesian experience as a Muslim majority country, but as a country which is highly diverse and highly complex, geographically challenged, and the challenge of the pace of change, and how they're dealing with some of the major problems that they're facing in society. And I was interested to see the extent to which the social capital in Indonesia was changing as quickly as everything else. The social capital are the networks, the connections that people have that make sense of their identities, their sense of belonging, and their sense of community. So these short words today can't do much apart from provoke a conversation, I hope. But I'll look at three interrelated issues: the context of change and insecurity, the systems of education, and the potential then of focusing on social capital. So in the challenge to all forms of violent extremism, educational institutions, including my own at Coventry University, are often tasked to play a pivotal role. There's an extensive literature globally on the role of schools and universities in tackling this problem. But I'm really attracted to the criticism that most of this is prescriptive. It tells us what educational institutions ought to be doing or could be doing. A considerable volume of discussion and research that explores the role of education in countering or preventing violent extremism. For us as educators, this must be a challenge all the time. And the research often results in calls for action, even the need for more research. At the same time, as a community, we generate libraries of papers that give different viewpoints. But such collections may be useful, but they can be very fragmented. I'm concerned that there are things that are missing in that whole approach. And the big missing gap for me is a reflective and systematic overview of what education systems, as well as institutions, are doing in different places, in different contexts. There's some really excellent work by Lynn Davis from Birmingham, which tries to look at comparative analysis across different systems globally. There must be a wealth of comparative experience there that would show us the extent to which systems elsewhere are doing sustainable things to confront this wicked problem, and whether any evidence of impact we should share. Now, I can't fill that gap in a short talk, but I wanted to set some boundaries to the discussion and some pointers to the research. I do think that researchers can help policymakers and leaders in education to step up in this way. Now, I'm framing this within an important thematic, the middle way, to which I was first introduced through discussion with my good friend, Professor Dr. Din Syamsuddin in Indonesia during an earlier global peace forum that I attended, and he inspired. For me, the middle way is an expression of the aspirations within that nation, within Indonesia, for its nation building, where unity and diversity, its slogan, captures the essence of the ambition and the challenge. It provides a powerful steer for all of us, this notion of the middle way. It's eminently transferable to conflicted terrains elsewhere. Just thinking about the middle helps us to recognize the destructive ends and edges at either extreme on a linear spectrum, and reminds us the importance of compromise, of accommodation, the coexistence, not removal of difference, and ultimately the state of human flourishing that comes in concepts such as harmony, a state of relations that I aspire to. It is more likely, in my view, to bring peacefulness in our communities. So in Indonesia, it's an imperfect experience, but it's an aspiration nonetheless, an emphasis on the middle way that requires a direct assault on the extremes, as I shall come on to discuss. So let me begin by reference to the wicked problem which I alluded earlier in the context. Wicked problems exude complexity, and a complexity so severe that simple solutions are non-starters. So violent extremism has become a wicked problem in our modern world. And there cannot be tests of effectiveness of solutions, essentially. Wicked problems actually can't be solved at all. We just have to mitigate or try and undermine them. Some of the researched and identified or even tried solutions more often not create new and different problems. Hence, wickedness is how it's defined. So that these are problems with many and complex sources, causes and drivers. There are no single explanations, and different contexts generate different problem characteristics. This is very obvious. I'm saying things that are not new. I'm trying to highlight and focus them on our table when we have a look at some of the issues. So what might explain, for example, why young teenage girls would leave their families and communities in a relatively stable East End of London, and the protective security that brought them, and travel unaccompanied to war zones in foreign places to become brides of insurgents and terrorist fighters? What might explain that? The causes and creation of this problem are far from simple, and solutions either for prevention in the first place or responding afterwards almost impossible, as we know, as we try and deal with this complex issue. So, a restricting family environment might prevent travel. So we point at parents and say, don't allow your children to travel. But that in itself, of course, as we know, can increase the desire in young people to travel in its own right. Punitive responses after the experience may create more sympathy for the teenagers than for the disincentives. So it's a wicked problem indeed. My wicked problem for this point, and our dialogue this morning or this afternoon, is the rise of violence as the language of disagreement. The real problem we have is that violence has become the language of disagreement. In social relations, we're in a world of violent extremism, far more pervasive than mere antisocial behaviour, with those who seek to promote and impose their views resort to extreme measures. For me, this modern language for disagreement is a major cause of our insecurity. So anyone interested, as I am, in developing peacefulness and peaceful relations, however complex the context, bound to want to look at how to undermine and to minimise the impact of violence. So violent extremism terrorises peaceful places, expressing anger and promoting different preferred worldviews. We had last November in Coventry a visit from Steve Kalele from Sydney, who sponsors the Global Peace Index. And the Global Peace Index for 2019 recently concluded that our world is more peaceful in 2019 than it was in 2018. Doesn't always feel that way at all. The reality is that the sources of human security have changed and are changing, and the violent actions of a few disturbs and prevents the harmony for us all. I think our current context with the violence of virus will be an interesting additional understanding, an additional problem for us to resolve and to assess. Whereas violent conflict between nations may fortunately be on the wane, violence within communities is not. And if the wicked problems cannot be solved, all that might be possible then is to open up the problem so that a wider and more diverse range of actions can be applied. So one of the strategies for transforming education systems in this context, and I'm sorry I'm having to talk over a lot of ideas and work, don't want to take up all your time, is seeing how education can be part of an opening up or a loosening of the problem space. I'm listening very much to the work I referred to earlier of Lynn Davis. This notion that this difficulty, these problems can be explored and opened up and loosened and freed up for us to assess or to feel differently about is a very important transformation for education systems to consider. It requires a framing that thinks of education in these systems' terms, not just a process by which learners learn. Otherwise, we become locked, I think, in a frame that seeks to change the curriculum or to change what people learn as a recipe for education's contribution to solving the problem. So we can teach young people to avoid violence, be more respectful, and so forth. But not only is education best seen as a system, but it also should be seen as a complex adaptive system, often part of a larger and even more complex system. I only came to systems analysis recently, and it's just excited me because a lot of things make sense that used not to me. So begin to think about your local school, a local school that you know, a university within a city you live in, within the complex and adaptive system of our nation state here in the UK, or in Indonesia, or in Egypt. A complex adaptive system, perhaps religion or law, the world economy, the global war on terror, all parts of that complex adaptive system. It's a system that responds to its context to survive by innovating and through change. Interestingly, education as a complex adapting system is far from stable. Itself, it's in a state of turbulence, of constant change, and even crisis or chaos. Now, when I talk to head teachers to say, are you a chaotic institution? They're, of course, hugely defensive. I talked to my Vice-Chancellor. I spoke with John Latham this morning, and he, of course, resists the notion that we're in an unstable case. That's his job, or many head teachers, it's their jobs. The bulk of literature that we have looks at schools and colleges in this way, tends to focus on the working of the school, the transformation towards effective learning and attainment. But I'm interested in how a theory of change rooted in complexity science can give some much more interesting clues towards educational practice that could possibly help or interrupt the spread of extremism and violent behaviours and refocus our attention on the middle way. So is there a theory of change that we can introduce to education as a system which can help confront some of these issues? Or do we return to a process in which learners are targeted by curriculum, by exhortation, by mentoring, by whatever else educational leadership brings to change behaviours and change aspirations? Seems intuitively sensible to me that education should be at the forefront of transformation, of language of violence, the language of disagreement away from being violence, and preventing violent extremism in our communities. Currently, however, formal learning within the educational institutions plays a very small part in prevention or countering these behaviours. And I think they play a small part because of this issue, because education is rarely conceptualised as a complex adaptive system. I work a lot with the UN system, and you're well aware, I'm sure, of UNESCO and the amazing work it's done, developing significant materials that provide guidelines and content for dealing with some of the issues I've touched upon. But with wicked problems, mapping actions against results is very, very difficult. There's often a problem of attribution. So fewer young people go off to become foreign fighters or get involved in violent activities in their communities or antisocial behaviour. Is it because of their educational experience or is it because of something else? Prevention necessitates measuring the negative and attributing causality when none can be fully determined. So we can't be confident that changing any one system will have the benefits that we want, or may not cause instability in the other systems that sit alongside. So this opening up, this loosening of the content, I think is one way forward. The opening up of the issues to which I referred requires much more care and attention to definitions, to causes, and to the identification of target audience. Let me finish on three issues. I'm very conscious of time. First, the difficulties of definition of our wicked problem. There are many kinds of extremist behaviour: political, ethnic, sectarian, separatist, criminal. There are no internationally agreed definitions of extremism, nor of violent extremism. I've used these terms willy-nilly this afternoon. You will have interpreted them in the way in which makes sense to you. But there isn't a standard internationally accepted definition, nor therefore of what countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism should actually target. There was a study done not so long ago by our partners at USIP, at the United States Institute of Peace, which looked at countering violent extremism and the struggle they have in defining a clear and compelling definition. As a field, it risks unhelpful associations. In fact, it's very clear that everything can be termed countering extremism if we're not cautious about definitions. Second point is we're always very anxious to identify the main causes of violent extremism so that we can apply solutions quickly and cleanly. So in any violent extremism 1.0 or 2.0, in the course, you'll get to the classroom and you'll start to be listing the causes so that you can eradicate them, so that you can address them. But the reality is that there's no simple analysis. As I've said, there's no clear journey in and out of extremism, and the involvement is in such behaviour by individuals is usually because of a specific issues with that individual. This ranges from the macro level: if it's poverty, make educational vocational for the marginalised, help young people find meaning and identify in work, or it's micro. Sometimes it's argued to be boredom, but then we have to make the school more exciting and more inspirational. So studies have interviewed former extremism. In fact, much of the work done by Fuad Nadi led to really good dialogue and their families, with the objective of trying to identify family or community patterns that made young people vulnerable or not to radicalisation. And no patterns could be identified, and the focus on individuals or dysfunctional families has not proved useful. So the third point, within education systems, is the problem of targets and what we should seek to achieve through learning. And I think this is the one area which I get most excited about wanting to change. Citizenship education, as an example, became very fashionable for a time. Developing character or virtue learning here was the target to promote and develop certain character traits and values: courage, justice, humility, characteristics associated with good citizenship, whatever that meant. But this approach itself is really problematic. Many of the traits are held common between those who are good citizens and those who are not. Loyalty, courage, humility, as well as setting up a binary of good versus bad. There's no guarantee how individuals will apply these attributes of loyalty, courage, humility. There may be many within the ranks of those who would seek to use violence and extreme behaviour. So importantly, character education's theory of change makes assumptions that if you produce sufficient good citizens, then good society with good overall behaviour results. That just needs thinking through. So if everyone comes through an education system and comes out with qualities and characteristics of being a good citizen, when you add them all up, the assumption is you become a good society. I don't think that's entirely plausible or entirely reasonable. And take the ending of slavery in North America or the peace agreements in north of Ireland, I think you'd look different things going on there. It's not a question of everybody being good, that add them all together and you get a good place. I'm not going to talk too much about religion and faith. We haven't got time, but I just wanted to make some final conclusions about education and its role. I think a complexity approach shows how a theory of change through dialogue, through education as a system, can help promote multiple alternatives, not one. And we must believe that in education, we can make small interventions which will make change in the course of time and will disrupt, sometimes only minimally. Education for the middle way should build on a system with a very special niche, a role for education. Characteristic or properties of this niche would include a healthy ability to disrupt and create turbulence. I've visited in my time in Indonesia many schools and many colleges where such behaviour, such conduct of disruption and turbulence was really not supported, not encouraged. Both productive forces that can provoke a system into creative activity, disruption and turbulence, are very healthy. A direct and assertive promotion of human rights and freedoms is also a second characteristic of the change. So we need a system of education that helps people to be disruptive and create turbulence in a constructive way, and that promotes human rights and freedoms. And finally, to build argumentative confidence and provide a platform for networking and sharing. So argumentative confidence is an important characteristic, which brought me, of course, in the work that I'm doing currently in Asia, to look more at social capital. Because for me, social capital creates the context and the frameworks and the networks and the communities that encourage education systems to bring about that sort of transformation. In terms of extremism, the turbulence that we need is disturbing path dependence into violent responses and unlocking the unintended negatives of sectarianism or separatism. In particular, through education, we can support the challenge to binary thinking, to black and white truths, them and us. Such binaries exist, we can challenge them. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Hardy, for exploring the role of educators and researchers and how they can play a role in combating radicalization, and bringing our concentration back to emphasizing the middle way. We've got a few questions come through. I think we were close to 70 viewers online. So the first question: my union, NEU, teachers is very suspicious of the prevent strategy. What is your opinion?
So direct and to the point. So yeah, so I am as well. I'm very disappointed that. Let me start with disappointment. Last year I did a big thing. I got really focused on giving up anger. So I didn't get angry about things anymore. I would try. So I look at disappointment and frustration. I think there's a problem here of good intent and poor impact. So that's how I see it. I think that I worked in my past in many contexts where the contest strategy of UK government was unpicked and designed and developed. And within that, as you know, the prevent strategy was one arm of counter-terrorism or counter-violent extremism. Its problem, however, not the intent. I think the intent was to say, if we can stop people, if we can prevent or remove the conditions, as I was saying earlier, we can remove some of this behaviour. But it's a complex system, as I said, and prevent is too simplistic. And what prevent has done in reality, in my observations, my humble observations, as it is tended to go for quick wins, to build upon simple assumptions that says that this community is most likely to exhibit characteristics that are antisocial and that are difficult or that are violent. And, you know, what Prevent has done in many cases has stereotyped communities, some communities more than others. It's a huge moral dilemma, and it's problematic. But I think by itself, Prevent is not a comprehensive solution to the problem that we face. I think in conjunction with other things, it would be seen in a slightly different light. It's rather like my analysis would be with Stop and Search in order to prevent young people in cities being killed by knife crime and so forth. Stop and Search seems eminently sensible thing to do. If you could get a guy, you can prevent a knife murder or killing by finding someone who's got a knife and removing the knife and the person, or at least dealing with it. But of course we know as well that Stop and Search is used for other things and is perceived to be used for other things. And in that case, it becomes a much more problem. So it's a wicked problem. You solve the problem of knives on the street, but you create an antagonism and a block of trust between young people and authority, which creates other problems alongside. So I'm anxious that Prevent is such a powerful aspect of the fight against this antisocial construct and the problems of violent extremism. And by itself, it can create more problems than it solves. But it's a really wicked problem. And you cannot, nobody can say we don't want to prevent violent extremism. But the particular model of Prevent, I'm less confident about, I have to say. But that's a personal.
Thank you. On to the second question. Dr. Nadi tirelessly worked with schools to ensure the tensions between faith communities are avoided in future generations. What is your view on faith schools?
So this is a really, gosh, we're getting good questions today. I'm in favour of faith schools, and I think the more there are, the more positive their contribution will become as a collective of institutions. I'm also very much against schools being seen as islands and silos that keep themselves to themselves. So I like schools as open systems. And if you open up your system and it's based on faith, there's a lot of good you can transmit and a lot of shared understanding you can take. So what Dr. Nadi promoted passionately and with amazing energy was not that the faith school was the problem, but the way in which the faith school interacted and interfaced with its context and its environment. So I would look to that as the issue, not whether the school or institution is forged or formed around a particular set of values or beliefs. That's not the problem. The problem is how you then sit in a multi faith and multi-ethnic context and how we cope with that. We're really bad at that. We're really bad at living the difference. And it's a really difficult thing to do. But you have to start with the premise that you don't deal with living with difference by removing difference. That's nonsense. And faith schools by themselves are examples of the difference that we need to cope with. So I'd have more of them, but I'd work heavily and really energetically at making them coexist in more constructive ways.
Thank you. Just to follow on with that, this is a question of my own. You mentioned the role of UNESCO and having the suggestions of how schools can implement these. Whether that be through citizenship lessons or any kind of other form. Do you think there is a way of kind of making this into a uniform method, so one which every school could adopt and use, or do they have to be unique to? I mean, if we're talking on a global scale, different countries, norms, cultures.
So I think what agencies like UNESCO do amazing work, and what I think we have to look carefully at their role and purpose. So I wouldn't use UNESCO's work as a recipe for how to cook your dish, or how to create your ideal institution or your ideal community. I think their responsibility is to generate a library of really useful resources that are developed in different contexts and can be shared in different ways. So it's only recent in our education system that we've spent really much more time on looking at cultural difference and cultural idiosyncrasies and cultural characteristics. And that's largely down to the work that UNESCO has done. It's very recent that we've looked at different cultural competencies and different cultural and linguistic characteristics of different cultures. And I think that's really important. But to suggest that UNESCO can create a blueprint by which we coexist, by which we develop more understanding of multicultural and intercultural communities is probably wrong. And I think some of the work they're doing on interculturalism and on cultural competencies is very useful, but it's a resource that needs drawing down and interpreting locally. I think.
Thank you. On to another question. What can we do on an individual level to promote educating for the middle way?
I think we can be more open and tolerant ourselves and less challenging of those who have the responsibility for teaching our kids. You know, I often think how difficult it is to be a teacher, because I am a teacher in a sense, but in higher education we're privileged to be in different contexts to those in the front line in schools in relatively challenged communities. But we're quite judgmental as individuals, as we are supposed to be. We protect our families, we're interested in our children, we want to be influential in the values and characteristics that they develop. So I think that by being another source of pressure on systems of education, we have to be cautious that the pressures we bring are constructive rather than negative, are supportive rather than confrontational. So we might worry. You take some real sharp issues. How should we deal with homosexuality in the school curriculum? Should we ignore it, which we used to do? Should we say it's a bad thing, which we have done in the past? Should we promote it? That's a bit extreme. You know, so it's a deal. But as an individual, you have a view about some of these very difficult issues. But I think what we can do for the men is to promote the way in which we explain or articulate our views in a more open and moderate and accommodating way, one of negotiations. So recognizing others in a positive light is a starting point. And the more we do that as individuals, the easier it becomes for those who we task with the responsibility of educating our children to do it with power and with effectiveness.
Thank you. Just to follow up with that question again, I mean, in the current era that we're in, you know, with the coronavirus, you see the lack of dialogue between teachers, parents, teachers and the students, as many things are kind of being transformed into an online mode. Is there any way which we can increase that dialogue, you know, to facilitate this and bringing these complex issues into the middle way online?
So I think it comes back to work that I've done for some years and I'm really interested in. I'm very not always very successful in bottoming out all the ideas, but I think that a lot of dialogue is problematic because it's driven by its purpose. So the dialogue is quite deliberative dialogue. It's done so that you achieve something. Whereas I think what I'm experiencing at the moment more of is a good thing, is a lot of dialogue that doesn't have a distinctive purpose, it's not an end point, it's just dialogue for its own sake. And I think if there aren't many benefits from this terrible time we're confronting at the moment, but there are some things that I hope we carry on doing. So every day at 11 o'clock, I meet my department at Coventry, 150 people. We come online on Microsoft Teams and we have a COVID-11s, we call it. So it has no purpose other than just to be there. And I think that's something that we didn't find enough time for before. So before we'd meet, with a purpose. We have to achieve this. This is our task. This is our objective. This is what we have to do. These are the decisions we need to take. That's all good, very necessary. But what we didn't, I think you probably do more of it when we're not in lockdown, when you bounce into someone in the corridor, when you see someone in the supermarket, you tend to stop and chew the cud, chat about whatever. The essence of dialogue is in its performance, not in its product, in the innovation that comes from exchange, not in something that's predestined or pre-designed. And I think we're seeing that much more powerfully now when we're forced into positions. So our coffee morning every 11 o'clock, some people come, some people stay, some people drop in and out, everybody's online. But the mere presence, the mere performance of having that dialogue, I think is a really good thing. And I'm sorry we didn't do more of that before, and we surely will when all this is over. We'll carry it on.
Hopefully. Thank you very much. I think we're on to the last two questions. If we are to work transformatively, how can we do this within the system? That's the first question.
Yeah, that's it's a really good question. I could bottle the answer. If I had it, I'd put it on a shelf and we'd sell lots of bottles. Part of this, is to unlock some of the relationships that clearly have developed over time around our work, right? So I think, for example, an academic researcher looks very closely at the impact of their work on their promotion prospects, on their career structure, rather than necessarily on the job on the issue and the output that they're creating. That's inevitable, and that's right. And you're looking for recognition, you're looking for praise, you're looking for acceptance, you're looking for a reward. All those things are the sort of incentives for the way you contribute. And I think that we've got to resist that if we can, as far as we're able. So yes, we want to progress, we want to tie our promotion and progression in with what we're doing, but actually we should be focusing on what we're doing just as much. And so some of those connections, some of those things that are joined up, we should try and free them up. I think that's what we mean, what I meant earlier, by loosening up the system, so that it wasn't, if schools only worked to impress schools inspectors, to get their Ofsted rating as outstanding, if they only worked to get all their students with A-level grades and O-level performances that got them into higher education, we'd miss a trick or two. So we've got to do those as well. But we haven't got to take our mind off and our sights off some of the other issues as well. Just, the best schools are happy places, are places where people flourish, where everyone reaches their expectation. I don't think that's easily measured by an Ofsted inspection. Look at the feelings. Of course they do. But actually what matters more are some of the key indicators. Feelings and emotions are really important and shouldn't be ignored. I'm probably doing great injustice to Ofsted, and they'll come back. And, I apologise, I don't mean to, but the point is made, I think.
Okay, thank you. And on to our last question. Though I agree that education should be a safe space for debate, but could there be a danger in encouraging turbulence and interpretation in certain cases?
This is always the big question. I don't think the danger exceeds the potential benefits, I have to say. And yes, education institutions, schools, colleges should be safe spaces. But there's no point having a safe space if you can't use it creatively, if you can't challenge and be disruptive within the context of that safe space. Now, I talked earlier about faith schools and their borders and how high the walls were around them. I think the answer to this question is the same. We must experiment, we must innovate, we must disrupt, we must be challenging within the context of our safe space. And then we have to negotiate how we take that challenge and disruption outside the safe space. And that's the trick. If we don't think more about that, then the safety will be meaningless. We'll have fun while we're there, but our young people will leave the school and be in a very unsafe place and not have the ability to cope. So I think we need the safe space. We need to challenge and use it. We need to explore, to innovate. We need turbulence. We need all those things that create energy and novelty. But we also need to learn how to transform, how to translate that into contexts which are less safe. So if you grow up in a school in which you have complete freedom, no authority, no structure, no discipline in the traditional sense, how are you going to be in a workforce which is driven by compliance and by rules and regulations, sometimes driven by rules because of safety issues or because of duty of care issue by the employer? So we have to get our young people in their safe spaces to know how to exit them in a constructive way. It's easy, isn't it, when I say it like that? Of course it's not. As I speak, I realise how difficult this is and how amazing some of our best teachers are and how they confront some of these challenges so positively and so well. They're amazing.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Hardy, for being here with us today for our first online live experience. I mean, I know it was a first for you as well. I'm sure this has ignited debate, which educators, researchers, and our viewers alongside will continue online for now and hopefully in the near future, real in person. Please do continue the debates in the comment section for our viewers online. Like, subscribe, and follow us on our other social medias as well, both Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And hopefully we'll be organising more, one-on-one discussions as well as panel discussions online too. Thank you.